Okay, this video is on consumer surplus and producer surplus, so let's dive right in. So this graph here is going to be very helpful to you as you memorize consumer surplus and producer surplus. So let's break it down. First of all, the x-axis is always going to be quantity. The input will always be quantity. And I do believe there's some WebAssign problems where the price is input. What you would do is you just turn it around. You'd solve for P so that your Q is your input. But anyway, Q is always going to be your input, and the market price, the P, is going to be your output or your dependent variable. And then you have a demand curve, and the demand curve is always going to have a negative slope, and the supply curve is always going to have a positive slope. So as quantity increases on the demand, the price is going to go down, and as quantity increases for supply, the price goes up. And so let's look at consumer surplus first. Consumer surplus is this area right here. And so we're going to find that area, and the way we're going to do it is we're going to find the market equilibrium, just like you did in Unit 1. And so this rectangle here is the market equilibrium. You're going to have an equilibrium Q, quantity, and an equilibrium price. There's your equilibrium point. Okay, and then you're going to find the area under the demand curve by taking the antiderivative. So if you look at the graph, you can see that the area under the curve, demand curve, is all of this. And then you're going to subtract out this rectangle area, which is length times width, Q bar times P bar. That's what we'll notate the equilibrium point, Q bar and P bar. So if you subtract the area under the demand curve minus this rectangle from 0 to Q bar, then you'll get this pink area right here. That's called the consumer surplus. What it is, it's a measure of consumer satisfaction based on the market price and what they are willing to pay. So this is the area of the graph below the demand curve but above the area of the rectangle formed by the market equilibrium. This area represents the area where prices are below what we as consumers are willing to pay. So therefore this is good for the consumer. So this red line is our demand curve. This is what we would as consumers would be willing to pay, but the market price is right here. So the area above the market price is called the consumer surplus. Here's the formula that I got from the book. You may want to memorize it, but we're going to find the consumer surplus in Excel in a way that's a little more easy to understand for some students, but some of you might like this formula. I'll explain it. First, X is the Q, quantity. If X bar P bar is a point on the graph of the price demand equation, P equals D of X for a particular product, then the consumer surplus CS at a price level P bar is CS equals the integral from 0 to the market equilibrium quantity of the demand curve, which you would take the antiderivative and evaluate from at 0 and Q bar and use the FTC to find the area in the demand curve, minus the integral of P bar from 0 to X. So this is a constant, and so the antiderivative of P bar is P bar X bar. And so you would subtract the area of the rectangle. And here's another way to think of consumer surplus. It represents the total savings to consumers who are willing to pay more than market equilibrium for the product, but are still able to buy the product for P bar. Let's look at producer surplus. Producer surplus is this purple area here, and it is the area above the supply curve but within the market equilibrium rectangle. So what we're going to do, since this rectangle area is larger than the area under the supply curve, we'll find the area of the rectangle, length times width, Q bar times P bar, minus the area under the supply curve, which would involve the antiderivative, evaluated from 0 to Q bar. The producer surplus is the benefit that the producer receives for selling a good for a higher amount than he or she would be willing to accept. So the producer surplus is good for the producers because it's the area of the graph above the supply curve but below the rectangle. So this is the price that the producers received for their product, but this is the price that they were willing to take. So they got more for their product than they were willing to take. This is called the producer surplus. Notice that the formula switches a little bit. The producer surplus is the integral from 0 to q bar, that's the same, of p bar, which the antiderivative of p bar is p bar x, and if you plug x bar in, you get p bar x bar. So the area of the rectangle is first, minus the integral from 0 to x bar of s of x, which means it's the area under the supply curve. And the producer surplus represents the total gain to producers who are willing to supply units at a lower price than p bar, but are still able to supply units at p bar. So this picture is very helpful to me to visualize. Consumer surplus is above producer surplus. It's below the demand curve, above the rectangle. Producer surplus is above the supply curve, but below the rectangle. So we'll look at some examples now in Excel. Okay, so for the first example, here's our demand equation and here's our supply equation. I just rewrote it because the function notation here is different than what we're used to, but this is input is Q, quantity, so D of Q, this is the price, but it's the demand equation. This is price. This is the supply equation. It's in terms of Q, so this is also price. And so first thing you want to do is find market equilibrium. So we'll put our input in, our demand equation in, our supply equation in a difference column, and type in the demand equation, 900 minus 20 times Q minus 1 times Q squared, because I don't like my understood -1 in Excel. Then the supply equation is Q squared plus 10 times Q. So my difference would be supply minus demand, and I'm going to goal seek the difference to 0 to find the market equilibrium. So this is a good review from Unit 1. And so I have this. This is my quantity and this is my price. That's my market equilibrium. Okay? Now, according to consumer surplus, we want to find the area under the demand curve from 0 to Q minus this rectangle. Next, I usually do the rectangle next. So this is the rectangle area, and it is simply the length from 0 to Q bar, which would just be this market equilibrium Q, times the height, which would be P bar. So basically, it's the revenue. It's length times width, Q times P. So we have our rectangle area here. And then the next thing I need to do is find the area under the consumer surplus from 0 to Q bar. So that's setting up a FTC. You can type in 15, or you can just go hit equals and click on your Q and then FTC. Okay, so this is going to be the antiderivative of demand, which would be 900 times Q minus 20 times Q squared divided by 2 minus 1 times Q cubed divided by 3. And so the FTC would be upper limit minus the lower limit. Alright, so this is our area under the demand curve. Alright, and then to find the consumer surplus, we are going to remember that the area under the demand curve is above this rectangle. So we are going to do area under the demand minus the area of the rectangle and get $4,500. The units would be dollars. And what this means is this is the $4,500 is saved by the customer because consumers were able to pay $4,500 below what they would otherwise be willing to pay. Up here's what they were willing to pay. This is what they had to pay. So the consumer surplus is the total that consumers saved because what they were willing to pay was higher than what they had to pay. Now let's do the producer surplus. So the producer surplus comes from the supply equation. You still need the market equilibrium, and you still need the rectangle. So I'm just going to copy it right back down. The only difference is now we're going to use the supply curve and find the area under the supply curve from 0 to Q bar. So this would be anti-S, and the formula is Q squared plus 10Q. I have that written right there. So Q to the third divided by 3 plus 10 times Q to the second divided by 2. That's the antiderivative of supply. And FTC. So we're going to subtract these values, upper limit minus lower limit value. All right, now producer surplus is the area above the supply curve, see that, but below the rectangle. So this rectangle area is bigger than this producer surplus area. We're going to find the area of the rectangle, and then we're going to subtract out the producer surplus to get this purple area. So basically you need to remember for producer surplus, you're going to do rectangle area minus antiderivative supply area under the curve. Okay, and so this is the producer surplus. And what that means is the producers sold their products for more than what they were willing to sell them for. So this $3,375 represents the amount of money they gained because they sold their product for more than what they would have been satisfied with. Okay, so here are the steps. To find the consumer surplus, we find the market equilibrium. We find the area under the demand curve from 0 to the Q value of the market equilibrium. We subtract the area of the rectangle formed by the market equilibrium from the area under the demand curve. So it would be consumer surplus is demand minus rectangle. Producer surplus, you also find the market equilibrium, and you also find the area of the rectangle, and you find the area under the supply curve from 0 to Q value of the market equilibrium. But this time you're going to subtract the rectangle minus the supply curve area. So I think I have this written down, maybe. Nope. So I can add that. If you want to like break it down and make it very simple, CS equals demand area minus rectangle area. Producer's surplus equals rectangle area minus supply area. So I just took out some of the words, and that's basically what you'll need to memorize. Okay, so example 2 says given the following supply and demand prices, find the consumer and producer surplus. So this one gives you a chance to review how you find a model for the demand curve and the supply curve. So my Q is my input, and the inputs are 10, 25, 30, and 50. Those are my quantity prices, and then quantity amounts. And then my demand price, or D of Q, is 10, 30, and 25, 18. And then my supply curve is 30, 25, and 50, 82. And so remember, if you type it in this way, Excel is really good at understanding what you mean, but just to be sure, you want to hover over the points. So let me do that. So these red dots are the points 30, 25, and 50, 82. So those are that's going to be my supply curve. So I'm going to add a trend line, make it a line, and I don't need my R-squared value. So this is my supply curve, and I can go in and edit. So this is S of Q, and this is Q. And then I'm going to hover over my blue points, 10, 30, and 25, 18. So that's right. And so I'm going to add a trend line. And that is my demand curve. So I'll edit the D and the Q. Okay, so now we're to review to find the producer surplus and the consumer surplus. For both of these, we need the market equilibrium. So this is going to be Q, D of Q, S of Q, and difference. My demand curve is negative 0.8 times Q plus 38. My supply curve is 2.85 times Q minus 60.5. My difference is supply minus demand, and I'm going to goal seek this difference column to 0. And so you get a Q quantity and a price. That's your market equilibrium. Quantity of 26.963 items and a price of $16.41. The next thing that you're going to need for both of them is the area of the rectangle, which is market equilibrium quantity times market equilibrium price, otherwise known as revenue. So that's the area of the rectangle. The next thing, I'm going to show you, if you're going to have to find both the consumer and producer surplus, a lot of times you might just want to go ahead and do it all at once. So the quantity from 0 to the market equilibrium Q, that doesn't change. The FTC doesn't change. And then right here, I'm going to type in anti-D, and here I'll type in anti-S, and my antiderivative demand is negative 0.8 times Q squared divided by 2 plus 38 times Q. And I'll drag that and create an FTC formula, which is upper limit area minus lower limit area. And then my anti-supply would be 2.85 times Q squared divided by 2 minus 60.5 times Q. And drag that to find the upper limit. And then the FTC would be this minus this. I'll just check my work because it's negative. Okay. Yeah, that's right. So sometimes you'll get a negative under one of these, but we'll see what happens when you find the consumer surplus and the producer's surplus. So the consumer surplus, if you remember the picture, here's your demand curve in blue. There's the market equilibrium. There's a rectangle right here. 26.9863, 16.4. And the area, the consumer surplus area, is right under this demand curve but above the rectangle. So that means the consumer surplus is the area under the demand minus the rectangle area. Alright, the producer surplus, this is the producer surplus line. There's the rectangle formed by market equilibrium. Right there's market equilibrium. And the area under this supply curve is here, but the area of the rectangle is bigger. So that is why you're going to do area of the rectangle minus area under the supply curve. And see that? That's what's going to take care of the negative, because you're minusing a negative, which gives you a positive. So this is the consumer surplus, $291.30. $2.30. It represents the amount saved by consumers because what they are willing to pay is higher than what they actually had to pay for the goods. Producer surplus is $1,037.77, and it represents the amount gained by producers because what they were willing to sell their items for was less than what they actually received for their items. Okay, so this last one I'll do with you is number 5 in the consumer and producer surplus in the lab manual, in that section. And I wanted to do it because the supply curve, the antiderivative is non-trivial, and so I wanted to do that and kind of remind you that you really don't want to be typing the derivatives in Excel without doing it on paper, because I won't be checking Excel on test 3 or the final exam. Okay, so I'm going to let Excel do that, but I'm going to need the antiderivative of the demand curve and the supply curve. So for the consumer's surplus, it's going to be 0 at whatever that market equilibrium point is. I skipped that, so I'm not doing that yet, of the demand curve, which is right here. So I'm going to write that down. Negative 0.4 q squared minus 0.8 q plus 39.6, and this is dq. So this antiderivative, this is a polynomial, so it's not too tough. It's just the constant comes down times q cubed over 3 minus 0.8 times q squared over 2 plus 39.6 q, and we're going to evaluate it from 0 and whatever your quantity market equilibrium value is. So that's our antiderivative. If you write that on your test paper, then I can see if you've made an error. Maybe you take the correct antiderivative, but maybe put an extra 0 in Excel, and that's why your answer comes out wacky. Well, at least I can give out partial credit for that. Okay, so the producer surplus comes from the antiderivative of the supply curve, and this is going to take a little bit more effort. We are going to evaluate from 0 to q bar, and I'm going to take it out of the radical, which is 200q plus 49 to the 1/2 dq. So remember, you have to use u substitution. We're going to let u equal 200q plus 49. Anytime you have a binomial or trinomial or something other than a monomial raised to a power, you have to use u substitution. Okay, so the derivative of 200q plus 49 is 200 dq. But I don't have 200 right here. I have 1 dq. So I have to do something to change this to 1 dq, and that is multiply both sides by 1 over 200, which is going to give me 1 over 200 du equals 1 dq. So now I have what I need to substitute in and make an integral that's a lot easier to deal with. So that would be, this is u, so u to the 1/2. 1 dq is 1 over 200 du. So I have a nice integral that I can take the antiderivative of, and so the antiderivative is 1 over 200 u to the 3/2 times 2/3. Well, if I substitute the expression I put in for u, I'll have 1 over 200 times 200q plus 49 to the 3/2 over, times 2/3. And I'm going to evaluate that from 0 to q bar. Okay, so now I'm back in Excel, and I have everything I need to be able to find the market equilibrium, the producer surplus, consumer surplus. So the market equilibrium, Q is my input. I'm going to type in my demand equation, my supply equation, and my difference. Supply demand equation is P sub D of Q. That means demand curve right there. Negative 0.4 times Q squared minus 0.8 times Q plus 39.6. Supply curve is the square root, so you can use rational exponents or you can use the SQRT function. I'm going to use rational exponents, so that's parentheses 2 times Q plus 49, close parentheses, caret. Let's correct something that's been happening on test. If you type in 1/2 this way, you will get the problem wrong. It's going to raise it to the first power, then divide the whole thing by 2. You need to put parentheses around it like this, just around the 1/2. But I have a better solution. If I am raising something to the 1/2 power, it's a lot easier to just type into the 0.5 power. Less keystrokes. Difference column would be supply curve minus demand curve. Goal seek this difference to 0 to find the market equilibrium. So now I have my quantity 4.12 and my price 29.53. You know, I haven't done one that is tricky with the units, so I'll just stop here and let's take a look at it. What I'm looking at is that Q is number of units and P is price in dollars. But what if it said Q is number of units in hundreds? Then when it came time to interpret, you would need to deal with that. So I'll just do some pretend at the end of the problem. I just want you to remember you got to look at your units and what they are. All right, so we have the market equilibrium, and now we're going to find the area of the rectangle. Area of the rectangle is the quantity times the price of your market equilibrium. And so again, if one of these was in hundreds, then you would need to multiply this by 100s. This is revenue. So the revenue would really be 121.54 times 100. So if one of these is in hundreds, then the revenue would be multiplied by 100. Okay, back to this consumer surplus. We need to find both of them, so I would just do the antiderivative of both in one little area. So I'm going to evaluate Q from 0 to the market equilibrium Q. And it's decimal, so I am definitely going to just click on the column. FTC means we're going to find the area under these curves. The anti-demand curve we found, and it was right here. So I'm going to type in negative 0.4 times Q cubed divided by 3 minus 0.8 times Q squared divided by 2 plus 39.6 times Q. I evaluated it from 0 to Q bar, and then I subtract the upper limit minus the lower limit. And then the anti-supply would be, we found it down, it's right here. So it would be parentheses 1 divided by 200, close parentheses, times parentheses 200 times Q plus 49 raised to the 3/2 power. Again, if you do this, you will get it wrong. You need parentheses before the 3 and after the 2, but I also know that 3/2 is 1.5, so that's what I'm going to do. Times parentheses 2 divided by 3. So if you tried to put 2/3 as a decimal, 0.67, that's going to give you rounding error. So you can only do it with terminating decimals. All right, so we'll check that. Okay, so that's the antiderivative of supply. And then area under the supply curve is this. And then consumer surplus and producer surplus. Consumer surplus is the demand curve. And it's the area under the demand, which is above the rectangle. So that tells me I need to click on the area under the demand minus the area of the rectangle. That's your consumer surplus. The producer surplus is the rectangle is above the supply curve, so I'm going to do rectangle minus the area under the supply curve. Get that. Okay, so this is the consumers. $25.37 is the total gain by consumers because what they were willing to pay was higher than what they actually had to pay. And the producer surplus is $36.83 because that's the total gain by producers because what they were willing to sell their item for was less than what they actually sold their item for. Okay, so again, to play around with the units, if this Q had said it was units in hundreds, or if this price had said dollars in hundreds, the actual market equilibrium for that type of problem would be $2,536.61, and the actual value for the producers would be $3,683.44. So just wanted to, since this one doesn't have that unit deal, wanted to talk about it. Let's see if I can find one where that is happening. Not in 4. There you go. The monthly quantity Q is in thousands, and the price is just in dollars. So you would want to multiply your final answers by 1,000.